Good evening, and welcome to Law Talk, the show that brings the law, the politics, and the Constitution to your home each month. Mark Malachowski and myself, James Baird, are here tonight to enlighten you. Mark, what are we talking about tonight?
Well, first of all, we're going to cover federal crimes and how the number of federal crimes has really expanded recently.
What kind of crimes are you talking about here, Mark?
Well, originally in the Constitution there were three main federal crimes, but that's expanded to today. There's 4,500 federal crimes.
But how as citizens are we supposed to take care and understand those laws? How do we abide by those laws?
Well, it's a little bit like Caligula when he put all these laws up top of these big columns that were really too hard for people to read, so he could kind of pick who he wanted to arrest and try, because no one could really see the laws on top of those columns. So, but the main feature of federal laws, besides they're a little bit inscrutable, is that there's no mens rea.
So we're talking about a strict liability standard, correct?
Right. There's no real malice or intent involved. If you did it, you're guilty.
Well, a simple example of that would be something like the statutory rape law, where if you engage in any kind of sexual contact with a minor, that you can automatically be charged and you're automatically guilty. So it's regardless of a intent to do it. It just becomes, was she old enough or was she not old enough? Is that correct?
Yes, but that would be a state law. That wouldn't be federal law. See, now in the constitutional republic that we have, the states usually have the police power. It's very rare that the federal government gets involved in police power. And so anytime the Fed starts making a lot of different laws that affect people in the states, there's kind of a question of states' rights and what is the federal government really doing involved here anyway.
Well, wait a minute. Who is enforcing these federal laws? Are these like park rangers or Border Patrol, or what's the law enforcement group that actually makes sure that the federal laws are complied with?
Well, the array of federal enforcement agencies is as complex as the federal laws themselves. I mean, you have the Park Service, you've got BLM, Bureau of Land Management, which you bring in the FBI. You've got park rangers maybe doing this on federal lands. You have the EPA, you have the Coast Guard. So you have a lot of federal enforcement agencies that can go onto state territory and enforce these federal laws. Okay,
so but is there a state right issue that comes up with this federal question about which laws are enacted, which laws should be abided by, or which laws are enforced? Or is this a state rights is no state right?
Well, I would say it goes into a broader policy perspective, as the state was really supposed to have the police power. And now with all these federal laws, the federal government is coming over, taking over a lot of that police power and taking away the state's freedoms.
Well, isn't that somewhere infringing on the 10th Amendment, where the states are supposed to have rights as their own sovereign geographic position, basically? But if the feds are coming in and enforcing those laws, aren't they usurping the laws of that state?
Yes, in many ways they are, and also there are territorial aspects, because a lot of federal territory exists in the state. And so the state has to, try to balance their budgets and do different things, but they can't really control the territory they have, because the federal government puts rules in place from, for example, the Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service, put rules in place that the state has no control over.
Yeah, but doesn't the state have to predict on their budgets how they're going to manage any given lands that are in their state? And how does the federal property that's in their own state get managed by a federal agency without the state having any involvement?
Well, the federal government would lease to different companies, or make it hands-off, for instance.
Well, I know that the early cattle ranching involved a lot of federal land, and I know a lot of mining involved a lot of federal land. But today, aren't most of the federal lands used for some type of purpose that can be either taxed, or money can be made for the state coffers, or does that money go to the Fed?
Well, a lot of land is just protected, so it can't be used for anything. As a matter of fact, some of these laws, for one example, there's a snowmobiler was lost out in a snowstorm, and his snowmobile broke down. So he went to the ranger station and said, "Look, save me. I need help with my snowmobile." Well, he was he was indicted and convicted because he went on some special protected territory that he didn't know was a federal protected area, and he was in a violation of a federal law there.
Well, under that strict liability, even if it was snowing, he didn't know where he was.
Right.
He had no way to tell. There was no fences, I take it. So he just drove into a certain area. The snowmobile broke down, and now he's charged with a federal offense.
And his defense was, you know, I wouldn't go and tell the Rangers I was here if I knew I was violating a law, but he was still convicted.
And what happened? What was his sentence?
I don't recall a sentence right now, but it's a lot of these federal laws you're coming into.
Well, it's prison time.
You could be prison time in several years. One case, there was an inventor, and he was trying to develop a hydrogen battery, so-called, so you could have hydrogen-powered cars. Because if you put hydrogen in a tank in your car, right, and if you have a crash, that hydrogen tank might explode. So what he was developing a substance, a sodium borohydrate substance that would kind of be like a sponge for the hydrogen, and you could draw that out as you're driving. And if you got in a crash or something, that wouldn't explode. So
you wouldn't be retaining the explosive problem that the fuel would be doing.
Yeah, that a gas would have.
Right.
So he was working on this, and he was using sodium, which is a flammable substance and can react and be explosive, as part of his experiments and as part of his production. And EPA came after him and gave him. Ended up giving him, I think 3 years in federal prison. I don't know.
But wait a minute, sodium, isn't that what we used in chemistry class when we were growing up? Where we'd have the little test, we'd have a little piece of it, and then we'd put it over the Bunsen burner. So what was he doing with sodium that was such a federal offense? I don't understand.
Sodium is reactive with water, so it tends to burn or react with water. Well, he was using that as part of, with the sodium borohydrate. Sodium borohydrate is usually used to bleach newspapers. In this case, he was using it, as a reservoir for its properties, and so it was just part of his chemical mixtures for his invention.
Yeah, but so what was the violation of the federal law?
Well, the violation of the federal law was that they were claiming that he had abandoned these chemicals. His explanation is that he had to go make some more money, so he went back to gold mine for a while, and he was saving up money to continue his experiments, and that these chemicals were worth a lot of money. He never meant to dispose of them. He was going to come back and use them.
But how much of these chemicals did he actually have?
Oh, there were several drums. There was like 30 or something, 55-gallon drums.
Okay, but don't they come in those large containers to begin with?
Yeah, they come in there and they're immersed with an oil on the top, so they don't get any water. And containers weren't damaged; they're in perfectly good shape. There was no leaking, nothing like that. But what the RCRA definition, it's a Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, right? Is the federal law the EPA uses. And they say, well, if it's a material, it's okay, but if it's a waste, that's bad. If it's sitting around for a waste more than 90 days, that's abandonment or a violation. But if it's material, it can stay there as long as it's safe, right?
Well, wait a minute. When you talk about abandonment, what does the term abandonment actually mean under federal law?
Well, once something's abandoned, it becomes a waste. And if you look at the definition of what a waste is under RCRA, it's something that's inherently waste-like.
Waste-like?
So the definition...
Isn't that a little vague definition there, Mark? I'm missing this. What's waste at that point?
Well, the waste is something you don't intend to use anymore. So
yeah, but I thought he was in the middle of experiments.
Well, that was his claim, but the Fed said no. You didn't continue. You weren't continuous enough. You weren't there. You weren't watching it, and so this became inherently waste-like because you weren't around. And
okay, so where he left it, and was he still operating or still inventing with it, or he had it stored?
Well, he basically had it stored. It was in stasis. Why he was going to get. He needed more fuel to heat his project. He was using a lot of butane or propane, and it was very expensive. And he was doing things at high temperatures. And he had a budget he had to come up with.
Right.
And so he wanted to go make more money. And
so he went off and did another project so he could earn his money on this project.
Mine some gold so he'd come back and invest in this project.
So what do you mean? So now they say he abandoned it, became waste, and that was the violation of the federal law?
Right, and the thing is, the landlord said he wasn't paying his rent. He said, no, he left a couple of pellets of sodium borohydrate that's worth thousands of dollars, which would cover a couple years' rent, and that was the deal with the landlord. Now there's a question, but the landlord was a little, they were looking at, are you a co-conspirator? Do you want to go down with this guy, what's going on?
So he actually turned like federal evidence against it.
But something like that. So basically the question was, had he paid his rent? And this guy said, well, I gave him a couple of pellets of this sodium borohydrate. It's worth a lot of money. And he accepted it, and that was my rent. And the other guy said, well, where's the rent receipt? Well, there wasn't a receipt. So that was basically the base of the abandonment is like you left it on some property and you didn't pay your rent.
Okay.
But
Well, listen,
they were all sealed containers. They were all, it was all, everything was ready to go back when he went back to work.
well, I got to tell you, this whole idea about 4,500 federal laws that we have no idea what they're saying is definitely, we ought to take those apart a little bit in the future. So what's our second subject tonight, Mark?
Well, our second subject is the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment is, it just came to notice just recently, because President Clinton was saying that if Congress didn't raise the debt ceiling, that the President Obama, could do an end run around Congress and do it through the 14th Amendment unilaterally.
Well, okay, what term in the 14th Amendment really allows the president to do that?
Well, there's some language in the 14th Amendment that says the validity of public debt of the United States, and then it goes on basically talking about incurred in the war with the Confederacy, shall not be questioned. So basically the validity of the debt of the United States shall not be questioned. Now, in context, when this was done, the 14th Amendment was in order to give blacks, rights as individuals in the United States.
Well, that's after the Civil War.
Right.
Of course, what that was all about was because there were so many people that were brought here. The origin of their origin basically was in question. So what they wanted to do is have a kind of a catch-all, so all the people that were freed at the end of the Civil War became citizens without a lot of any paperwork, or is that what you're referring to?
The wording was anyone who was born in the United States, or I mean, I'm not sure if that's the exact wording, but if you were born in the United States, you're in. But also they talked about any debts incurred by the Union when they were fighting the Confederacy had to be paid by the United States. And the reason they wanted to do that, because the Confederate States, right, when they lost to the Union, well, they didn't really feel like paying the debts that were used to shoot at them or shoot them. So there was a big problem here, was like the Confederate States didn't want to pitch in and pay for
I understand the Confederate States didn't want to pay for anything because they lost the war.
Right.
They had already lost their manpower effectively to take care of their agricultural businesses. And what had happened was, I was under the impression that when the states reunited, that the debt then became the debt of the country.
Right.
And the United States then could exercise whatever it needed to do to ensure the debts were paid.
Right, and so that's what that clause was about. But then law professors have said, well, wait a minute, there's a broader connotation to this. It's not just the fact that we want to make sure the Confederate States that are now back incorporated in the Union have to pay their share of the debt that was used by the Union to attack and defeat them. We could use this in a broader context to basically save the Republic or in an emergency.
Well, wait a minute. So now they've taken reuniting the states into the Union to save the Republic, as though that's a catch-all for any problems that face the United States financially?
Well, yeah, they're saying that, for example, Obama could use this to raise the debt ceiling unilaterally. And then there's also an interesting thing. Some professors say that there's actually what they call popular constitutionalism.
Wait a minute, I'm not going to let you say that unless I understand what you're really talking about. What is popular constitutionalism?
Okay, well, that's a lot like the living Constitution.
The ever-changing.
And the reasoning behind that is that the public perception of what the Constitution means is what it means. And so that would be kind of like saying, like, if we had a mortgage agreement, you're supposed to pay $3,000 a month on your mortgage.
Right.
And you decide, well, I think the meaning of this document that I signed and you gave me a house for means I only have to pay you 3 cents. Well, that's your perception. So basically, whatever this public perception or whatever the popular Constitution means, it's basically welching. I mean, the contract between the government and the citizenry is just, it's any kind of nonsense that anyone wants to
I'm sorry, Mark. This idea of the popular Constitution is actually, I have no doubt in my mind that's just another way to say that we can do whatever we want while we're in the government, and those that stand between us and our end goal are going to be rolled over. Is that what we're talking about?
Well, I mean, if you want to live in a utopia, sometimes you have to cut some corners.
Well, sometimes a utopia is not necessarily what we should be living in.
Yeah, if you want.
But we don't live in a utopia.
You have to cut some corners. Anyway, on the other hand, some professors say, well, look, if they did this 14th Amendment end run around the Constitution, around the Congress, who's supposed to control the purse string, and the whole duty of Congress is.
Well, that's why they have the 3 houses.
Yeah,
but
really,
three separate tiers of the government.
The main thing about Congress is they're supposed to control spending.
Correct.
And if the president's going to do an end round about that, that would be grounds for impeachment.
Well, now. Impeachment is a serious matter. And are you speculating then, if he tried to do an end run utilizing the 14th Amendment under the popular constitutional concept, that in fact that would be setting him up to be impeached by Congress?
Well, he probably would be impeached by the House, but
for what reason?
I guess, becoming a dictator.
Well, that I
and but he probably wouldn't be convicted by the Senate. I mean, just vote-wise. But there is something that was that happened the other day. There was a lot of a drama at the White House.
And what was that?
Well, there was a man trying to hurl himself over the fence.
And why was he trying to do that?
Well, luckily the Secret Service interceded and they convinced President Obama to stay for another year or so. So,
which way was he trying to go?
that was taken care of. But so that's what's going on now. You know, the debt ceiling situation's really gotten so bad that people are wondering if Canada's going to let us sleep on the couch if things don't work out. But right now, we'll see what happens there.
Well, we do know that the debt ceiling is a serious matter, and the problem with the Congress is that they're frozen in the old way to look at things. But I understand that Ecuador had an issue that somewhat falls into this, and where is that going?
Well, it's interesting. Ecuador is a progressive utopia, and everything works fine there. And they had the police there were going to have their pensions cut.
Okay, what happened then?
Well, we're not really sure. I mean, there's conflicting stories. One story that was reported by the press is it was something happened in a hospital. There were 40 police there, and they were striking because they didn't want to have their pensions cut. And well, I don't know how many were there striking, but 40 apparently were liquidated or massacred by the government forces, by the army. Now, that's one report. We don't really know what happened. When the newspapers printed stuff to this effect, the editors of those newspapers got 3 years in jail and about $30 million worth of fines.
Well, was that 30 million American dollars that they got fined, or was this 30 million pesos or sucres as they use in Ecuador?
I'm not sure which the 30 million or what the exchange rate is, but at any rate, that was one way of dealing with this whole kind of, like in the country today, we have a big problem with pensions and that kind of thing. When you can see in a progressive utopia, the way they deal with it is pretty, like I said, it's pretty efficient. They just
off with their heads.
Yeah, off with their heads. Well, but we don't really know because the newspapers said that happened, and then now the newspapers newspaper editors are in jail and they're fined. The newspaper editor is saying this is kind of a puppet court, and this isn't valid. But the president says he was defamed and libeled by the charges that he took out some of these police. So we don't really know what happened.
I understand the president was a progressive. And that he's along with the same progressive nature of Hugo Chavez and the president of Bolivia. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's true. But I mean, I'm just saying all governments now are dealing with these kind of public servant pension problems, and they're all handling it in different ways. I mean, it's like a similar thing in Wisconsin. They have the pensions and they have the collective bargaining issues, and they just had a whole recall effort on that.
Yeah, well, isn't this where because the governor had actually passed laws with the help of the Republican Congress that this is when some of the Democratic people decided to leave the state, right?
Yeah, the legislatures went over to the next state,
right?
Because that way they wouldn't have quorum, so they couldn't do the vote.
But that was litigated, and I understand that there was one judge that's a former union person or something that's actually a judge that stopped that law from being implemented.
Okay, well, there was some detail in the Democrats left the state. The Republicans did an emergency meeting or passed it in spite of the Democrats being missing, is my recollection. And then the judge ruled that they didn't give 24-hour notice, even though I think
that's a quorum requirement.
Yeah, well, no, there was a notice because an emergency meeting they needed a 24-hour notice. But the thing had been on TV for several months. It was hard to believe that people didn't get notice, but that was the ruling. And then that lost on an appeal because the judges looked at it and said, well, I saw it on TV. I mean, I was noticed.
Everyone was noticed.
So it's like that. And they also kind of rebuked that judge for maybe a little bit overreaching. So then the next round in this was the Supreme Court justices, right? They went for a recall on the Supreme Court, or there was a vote up for the Supreme Court justices.
Right.
And then
that would set the balance on the court.
Right.
On which
would
side
change the balance.
Yeah, would change the
balance.
balance.
Well, the conservative side prevailed, And then there's a whole other thing we talked about the other night. Actually, one Supreme Court justice got in some kind of dispute with another one. There's like they claim that she maybe tried to grab her or strangle her or something like that. But we don't know how that one's going.
That sounds like more what happens in England.
No, but I mean, we don't know what's happened on that one, but there's some allegations of that one Supreme Court justice went after another.
Can we go back for a minute? What was the result of that recall election where they were trying to recall 6 Republican
Okay, well, that comes late. There was the recall. There was the vote on the Supreme Court, which was supposed to be a referendum on this, and then the conservatives won that one. But then there's still some charges of some dispute between the justices themselves. And then there was recalls in the Senate. Okay, so basically there was 6 conservative seats open, right? And
based on the recall.
Based on the recall, and I think that the Liberals had to take at least 3 of those to prevail, to have a majority. And I think they only took 2.
Yeah, I understand they only took 2, but I also understand that next week they're actually going to have an election on 2 of the Democratic congresspeople that would then, if they lose both of those or they lose one of those, are even further in the minority than they currently are.
Well, yeah, they would end up, but they would have had to retain in those 2 seats in next week's election, plus take 3 out of the 6 in yesterday's election.
But they didn't take 3; they only took 2. So even if they retain those 2, they're still in the minority.
Right. So
which means that this is a kind of a rebuke to all the money that was spent to throw the Republicans out of office, isn't it?
Well, I'm not sure how much money they spent, but it was in the millions. And
wasn't it 31 million?
I think it was in the tens of millions, 30 million. But the thing about it, what they were saying is, why this is kind of an interesting case is because they're saying if you can't have collective bargaining, which basically means there's a state law that if you want to work for the government, you got to pay dues directly to the union, and the union tends to give those union dues to, the union bosses tend to give those union dues to politicians who hire more government people and raise more taxes.
Well, traditionally, I believe the unions, as we've talked about on several of our shows, the unions are more pro-Democrat than they are pro-Republican. So as a result, if the Democrats are voting more money for the unions are donating more money to the Democrats, and it keeps the cycle going.
We went through this. It's a win-win for everybody. I think we've already gone through this. But the point is, they're saying
win-win for everybody.
It's a win-win
except for the Constitution.
Well,
that's now the popular Constitution.
It's like there's no money like taxpayer money. But okay, but the thing in Wisconsin is very liberal, and so they're saying if they can't hold into the state law, which makes it a law that you've got to pay the union bosses in order to work here. So basically, what you have taxpayers' dollars just going straight to the union boss. You have no control, and you've got to be in the union or have the job. So that's called collective bargaining.
But that collective bargaining was originally established to help the group be able to get a better deal with the governments, they weren't getting a better deal.
No. Collective bargaining makes sense in the private sector. That's just my opinion. You can have collective bargaining in the private sector, but in the public sector, even FDR
taxpayer dollars.
Even FDR has said, well, you can't have collective bargaining in the public sector because the same people you're bargaining with are you. You're bargaining with yourself.
And that's
it's like
you want to make sure you give yourself the best deal possible, and so you're going to bargain to make sure you get the best deal.
But Wisconsin's very liberal, so they're saying if they can't keep collective bargaining, and also unions, because laws to protect the workers are getting stronger and stronger, more pervasive, a lot of things that the unions fought for before have been won. So there's not that many private sector unions left because they're just not as popular as they used to be. Right. So now more and more unionism is going into the public sector.
Right.
And and so this is a huge thing because public sector workers tend to make about 25% more than private sector because they get much better benefits.
Exactly.
Generally under Title IX, some of them have to be hired. They can't be fired. Usually they die before they're laid off. So that's not like the private sector, which if you have a cutback, people get laid off or demoted or transferred or something. Usually in government, they're there for forever.
Well, the only problem with that, there's a whole other problem with that, is the fact that the taxpayer is responsible for ensuring that the public sector unions can survive because they're having to pay their paychecks, pay their pensions, pay their retirements, and all of that, right? So what happens when the public sector becomes one big union? There's insufficient taxpayer funds to pay that, and that's where we have the problem in California, where we have the correction and we have the Teachers Association, and those 2 unions alone control the government in Sacramento.
Well, the biggest lobbyist force in California is the prison guards, because That's actually our biggest business here. We have a big business, and it depends. Like San Francisco has a big business in welfare, basically. You know, they've got more, you know, help for people. People come for all money, you know, to be taken care of. But California's a huge prison system. That's our biggest interest.
Well, we know that the prisons are about 140% or more, and we also know that you have teachers educating, you have the prison, you have the correctional officers incarcerating. So then,
agriculture is actually the biggest.
Feeding each other.
No, but I mean the agriculture is basically the biggest business in California. But the biggest lobbyists are the
teachers. Well, it's the teachers in the prison.
The prisons. So they've got But the thing is, Wisconsin's even more liberal than California. And so if they can't win
Wait a minute. You're saying Wisconsin's more liberal than California?
Yeah, that's
How can that be, Mark? Off with their heads.
So I'm just saying there they thought that that's why they wanted to concentrate and do this battle there.
Right.
Because they thought that, you know, they'd have the best chance of prevailing. So
but they are prevailing, and they're fighting the unions. And
no. The liberals thought they could prevail
but they didn't.
Well, not so far.
Not yet.
They've had some little setbacks, but you know these things can always turn around. But that's just kind of the play-by-play of what's going on there. It's kind of interesting to watch. You know, you have the president of Ecuador deals with pension issues one way, Governor Walker in Wisconsin deals with another. We really haven't had Jerry Brown really come out with any particular, you know, explanation of how he's going to deal with unfunded liabilities or what's going to happen.
He's closing a few parks.
You know, but I'm just saying, you know, he hasn't really addressed that.
Right.
He was gonna put something, I think, on the ballot, but I don't know.
No,
if
he
that got
doesn't
off the
have
ground.
anything on the ballot, and unfortunately, our current governor is very pro-union, has been pro-union since his days as his first governor in the 70s, and that's just the nature of the beast.
Well, Jerry Brown's a good guy. I mean, I'm sure he'll come up with something, but we haven't really seen what he's going to do yet. He had promised a referendum or something, you know, initiative process. I don't think they've got that off the ground. So I guess they had some tax receipts come in for California higher than they expected, so they have a little bit of breathing room. But they haven't really dealt with these issues like Wisconsin has or Ecuador has.
Well, I got to tell you, I think the balanced budget in Ecuador is something to be looking to at this point. Well, anyway, Mark, it's been a really interesting discussion tonight. And do you have any parting words?
Well, I would just say that Ecuador is a nice place to be. I've been there, and it seems like they're having some problems. We don't really know what's going on, but we hope it all works out for the best for them.
Well, I got to tell you, we established a utopia here in the United States now, and that we should be looking to Ecuador as our model.
Well, I don't know if we've quite gotten to the utopia yet. We still have some private property left, but that's hard to say.
Well, are we getting to the point where there will be no private property?
Well, I guess if you have it in gold or cash, you're okay for right now. But it's hard to say. It's hard to say where the private property ought to be. That's a tough question.
Well, where should it be? Should it be in the hands of the citizens or the hands of the government?
Well, most of it's in the hands of the government right now. But what's interesting, banks are starting to charge